The dumpster behind Rio Fresco Cannery sat at the edge of a caliche lot in Mission, Texas, and on a Tuesday morning in July, it held about 400 pounds of pineapple skins, cores, and crowns, sweating in 98-degree heat, drawing wasps from a mile off. Yolanda Briseño stood next to it with a feed sack in her hand, and the smell hit her before anything else did. Sweet, sharp, a little like vinegar already starting, though the fruit had been cut only that morning. She was 26 that summer, back in the Rio Grande Valley, after 2 years in Houston that hadn't gone the way she'd planned. She'd taken a job answering phones for a property management company, lost it when the company folded, and come home to her mother's house in La Jolla with about $1,100 and no clear next step. Her mother worked the packing line at Rio Fresco 3 days a week, sorting canned pineapple rings for export, and it was her mother who mentioned, almost as a joke, that the plant threw out mountains of peel and core every single day because the only thing they canned was the rings and the juice. Nobody wanted the skins. The cannery paid a hauler to cart it to the county landfill twice a week and paid a permit fee on top of that for the smell. Everyone Yolanda mentioned this to had the same reaction. That's just trash. It's not worth anything. Don't waste your time. Her mother's supervisor told her the plant used to have a hog farmer take some of it for feed years back, until the farmer sold out and moved to Corpus. After that, it just went in the ground. It was, by any normal measure, garbage, wet, heavy, expensive to move, and rotting within a day if you didn't do something with it. What Yolanda knew, from a great aunt in Nuevo Laredo who used to make it every summer, was that pineapple peel was the whole point of tepache. Tepache is a lightly fermented Mexican drink, usually a day or two of fermentation only, made from pineapple rind, piloncillo, unrefined cane sugar sold in cone-shaped blocks, water, and sometimes cinnamon and clove. It's not the same as making vinegar, and it's not beer. It sits in that narrow, tricky window where wild yeasts and bacteria are just getting started, giving you a little fizz and a little tang, and then you drink it before it goes much further, because if you let it run, it turns to vinegar on you. She didn't decide to start a business. She decided to see if she could make one batch the way she remembered her tia doing it, mostly because the skins were sitting right there, free, and she was bored and broke. She asked the plant manager, a stocky man named Efrain Solis, who'd run the line for 11 years, if she could take a sack of skins instead of them going in the dumpster. He shrugged and said, "Take as much as you want. It's saving us a hauling fee either way." Her first batch, made in a 5-gallon bucket in her mother's garage, was a disaster inside of 36 hours. She'd used too much piloncillo, nearly double what her memory told her, because she wanted it sweeter, stronger, and she'd sealed the bucket with a tight lid because she was worried about fruit flies. Wrong on both counts. The excess sugar gave the wild yeast and bacteria far too much to work with too fast, and the sealed lid meant the carbon dioxide the fermentation produced had nowhere to go. When she checked it on day 2, the lid had bulged like a drum, and when she cracked it, foam sprayed to the garage ceiling, and underneath the foam sat a slick of gray mold across the surface. Because a closed anaerobic environment without any protective acidity yet established is exactly the environment certain molds like. She dumped the whole bucket, rinsed it, and sat on the back steps trying to remember what she'd actually seen her great-aunt do, versus what she'd guessed at. She tried again a week later, this time leaving the bucket loosely covered with a cloth, tied down with string, so gas could escape, but flies couldn't get in. That batch didn't grow mold, but at 4 days, it had gone completely flat, thin, and sour, nearly straight vinegar, sharp enough to make her eyes water. She'd let it go too long. Tepache is meant to be caught early, usually at 18 to 48 hours depending on the ambient temperature, when the yeasts have started converting sugar to a little alcohol and carbon dioxide, but before the acetic acid bacteria take over and turn it fully sour. In July heat, In an unair-conditioned garage running close to 90 degrees most of the day, that window closed twice as fast as it would have in a Mexican kitchen in a mild month. She hadn't accounted for the fact that fermentation speed is driven almost entirely by temperature, and Texas in July is not a mild month for anything. Her third attempt she caught at the right time. The liquid had gone a warm amber color, small bubbles rising steadily, a smell that was sweet and a little like beer and a little like fruit, with a taste that had actual lift to it, a pleasant sourness instead of a punishing one. She strained it, poured it into 2-liter soda bottles she'd saved and washed, and put them in the refrigerator to slow things down. 2 days later, one bottle exploded inside the fridge. Not violently, but enough to blow the cap off and spray Tepache and pineapple pulp across her mother's milk and eggs. She hadn't realized that even in the cold, fermentation doesn't fully stop, it slows, and a sealed plastic bottle with active yeast still working will keep building pressure. Commercial bottlers deal with this by measuring the sugar content precisely before bottling and controlling exactly how much fermentable sugar is left, so the carbonation builds to a predictable, safe level. Yolanda was working from memory and a kitchen scale, not from any real measurement, and she'd just been lucky the first 2 times. It was around then that her mother suggested she talk to Doña Refugio Elizondo, a widow in her 70s who lived 2 streets over and had made tepache, mango water, and horchata for church fundraisers for as long as anyone in La Jolla could remember. Doña Refugio was not, by nature, a talker. Yolanda came by with a jar of her failed batch to ask what had gone wrong, and the old woman smelled it, tasted a spoonful, made a face, and said only, "Se te fue de las manos." It got away from your hands. Then she added the one piece of advice that would end up doing more work than anything else Yolanda learned that summer. Fíjate en las burbujas, no en el reloj. Pay attention to the bubbles, not the clock. At the time, Yolanda took it as a general encouragement to trust her senses. It would be months before she understood it as an actual technical instruction, that the right moment to bottle Tepache isn't a fixed number of hours, it's a specific visual and textural cue, a steady, fine stream of bubbles rising from the bottom of the vessel, a slight give of foam at the surface, and a taste that's tart-sweet, not flat and not harsh. Temperature changes the clock every single day, so the clock is useless. The bubbles are not. Doña Refugio also gave her 3 practical rules that summer, delivered without ceremony, mostly while doing something else with her hands. Use ripe piloncillo, not white sugar, because the minerals in unrefined cane sugar feed the wild yeast better and give a rounder flavor. White sugar ferments faster but thinner. Never use metal utensils or containers for the ferment itself, because the acid produced during fermentation reacts with metals like aluminum and copper, pulling trace metal into the liquid and giving it a flat, tinny taste, and in some cases making people sick. Glass, food-grade plastic, or ceramic only. And always keep a piece of the previous batch's peel or a splash of the finished liquid to start the next one, because wild fermentation depends on whatever yeast and bacteria happen to be present on the fruit and in the air of that particular kitchen, and a consistent starter meant a consistent product, batch to batch, something Yolanda hadn't grasped yet, because so far, every batch had been a fresh gamble. She lost a batch to contamination that August that taught her the value of that last rule the hard way. She'd used peel that had sat 2 days at room temperature before she got around to it. The cannery gave her a fresh sack, but she'd let it wait, thinking peel was peel. By the time she started the ferment, unwanted bacteria had already gotten a head start colonizing the fruit's surface, competing with the yeast she wanted. The batch came out sliming, with a smell like rotten eggs, sulfurous and wrong, and she threw out both the batch and the sack of peel that had produced it. After that, she picked peel up from the cannery the same morning she planned to start a batch, never later. Her first sale wasn't really a sale at all. In September, her neighbor, Herminia Cavazos, saw the row of covered buckets on Yolanda's back porch. and asked what on earth she was doing. Yolanda gave her a jar to try, expecting nothing, and 2 days later, Herminia came back with $4 and asked for another one, because her husband, who worked outside in citrus groves most of the day, said it was the best thing he'd had all summer for the heat. Cold, a little fizzy, a little tart, cutting through the humidity better than soda did. Yolanda hadn't priced anything. She just took the $4. Word moved through La Jolla, the way it does in small towns, mostly through women talking after church and in the checkout line at the H-E-B. By October, she was selling maybe 6 or 7 quart jars a week out of her mother's refrigerator, $4 each, and it was covering her ingredient costs, piloncillo, mostly, since the peel was still free, with a little left over. She started keeping a plastic tote in the back seat of her car with jars packed in ice, so she could drop off orders without people coming to the house. The real turn came in November, when she signed up for a $10 table at the weekend farmers market in nearby Mission, the same town where the Cannery sat. She brought 2 coolers of jars, a card table, and a hand-lettered sign, and she sold out in under 2 hours. 30 jars, at $5 each this time, because a friend had told her she was underpricing herself. People kept coming back the next table over, asking if she had more. She hadn't planned for demand outpacing supply, and it forced her to actually scale her process for the first time. Instead of 1 5-gallon bucket, she moved to 4 food-grade 30-gallon plastic barrels, sourced second-hand from a restaurant supply company in McAllen, each one washed with hot water and unscented soap, never bleach, since bleach residue would kill the very cultures she needed. Scaling up taught her a lesson that small batches had hidden from her. Heat doesn't move evenly through a big volume the way it does through a small one. Her first 30-gallon batch fermented unevenly. The center of the barrel, insulated by all the liquid around it, ran warmer and finished faster than the liquid near the plastic walls, which cooled slightly overnight. When she bottled it all together, some jars were nicely balanced and some were already turning sharp. She started stirring each barrel twice a day, gently, with a long wooden paddle, to even out the temperature and distribute the yeast, and she began checking bubbles at multiple depths, instead of just skimming the surface. It fixed the inconsistency, but it also meant fermenting was no longer something she could just leave alone in a corner. It needed tending, twice a day, on a schedule that didn't care whether she felt like it. By early the following year, she'd lost her first real account before she'd even fully realized she had one. A taco stand in Alton had started buying 8 quarts a week to sell by the cup, and after 5 good weeks, Yolanda showed up with a batch that had gone further than she meant it to. She'd been rushed that week, helping her mother after a minor surgery, and skipped a stirring and a tasting, and bottled on the clock instead of on the bubbles. The batch was noticeably more sour than what the stand's customers had gotten used to. The owner, a soft-spoken man named Abel Nuncio, didn't complain. He just quietly stopped ordering. It took Yolanda 2 weeks to notice the account had gone cold, and when she called him, he told her plainly that the last batch wasn't like the others, and he needed to be able to count on it being the same. She never forgot that. Doña Refugio's line came back to her differently after that. Pay attention to the bubbles, not the clock. Because the one time she'd trusted the clock over her senses, out of exhaustion, it had cost her a paying customer. She got the account back 3 months later by bringing him samples for a month straight, until he trusted the consistency again, but she never skipped a check after that, no matter how tired she was. That spring brought a different kind of failure, one that had nothing to do with fermentation technique and everything to do with running a business on a waste stream she didn't control. Piloncillo prices spiked hard in March, nearly 40%, after a poor sugarcane harvest in Mexico drove up cane sugar costs across the border. Yolanda had been pricing her tepache, assuming piloncillo would stay around what it had been the previous year, and suddenly, her margin on every jar had nearly disappeared. She raised her price from $5 to $6 a quart, worried she'd lose customers, and lost almost none. People were already used to paying more for something homemade than for a can of soda, and the increase was small enough not to sting. It taught her that she'd been pricing on habit rather than on her actual costs, and from then on, she recalculated her price every time piloncillo cost changed by more than a few cents a pound, rather than waiting until she was losing money to notice. The cannery itself very nearly became a problem instead of a resource that same year. Rio Fresco processed pineapples seasonally in heavier volumes during certain months, when import shipments came in through the port of Brownsville, and in the slow months, the peel volume dropped sharply. Some weeks barely enough for 2 barrels instead of 4. Yolanda hadn't thought about seasonality until she found herself short of raw material with a farmer's market order already promised. She started asking Efrain Solis, the plant manager, for advance notice of the incoming shipment schedule so she could plan her batches around it instead of discovering a shortage the week it happened. Efrain, who by then had grown genuinely curious about what she was doing with his plant's garbage, started saving her the freshest peel specifically, separating it from the general waste bin so it wasn't sitting exposed to flies and heat before she picked it up. What had started as him doing her a favor slowly turned into something closer to a supply relationship. He'd text her the shipment schedule a week ahead, and she'd plan her fermentation calendar around it. By that summer, a year after she'd started, Yolanda had outgrown her mother's garage and refrigerator entirely. She rented a small commercial kitchen space by the hour from a woman in Mission who ran a catering business and only used her kitchen on weekends, and got a food handler's permit and a cottage food producer registration through the state. Since Texas allows certain fermented beverages to be sold under specific low-risk food rules as long as they're properly labeled and the alcohol content stays below a legal threshold. Tepache, made and sold quickly, typically stays under 1% alcohol by volume, well within the range that keeps it classified as a non-alcoholic beverage rather than something requiring a liquor license. But she had it tested periodically at a lab in McAllen just to be certain, since letting a batch run long enough could push it higher, and she wasn't going to guess about that. A chef from a new restaurant in McAllen called Rio Verde found her at the farmer's market that August, tried a cup, and asked if she could supply enough for the restaurant to serve it as a mixer for a mezcal cocktail and as a non-alcoholic option on its own. That was a different kind of order than anything she'd filled before. 20 gallons a week, delivered on a fixed schedule, with an expectation of exact consistency in sweetness and carbonation every single time, because a restaurant can't tell a customer that this week's batch tastes different. It forced her to formalize what had until then been mostly intuition. She started measuring the sugar content of her piloncillo water with a refractometer, a small handheld device that measures how sugar bends light passing through a liquid, giving her a number, degrees Brix, that told her exactly how much fermentable sugar she was starting with rather than guessing by taste. She began tracking fermentation temperature with a simple thermometer taped to the outside of each barrel, logging it twice a day in a notebook alongside the time she started each batch, so that instead of just watching bubbles, she had actual data connecting temperature, time, and the final taste, and could predict roughly how long a batch would need depending on the season. Doña Refugio's advice about bubbles over clocks had been exactly right when she had no way to measure anything else. Now that she had numbers, the two together, the readings and her own trained senses, let her hit the same flavor within a narrow, reliable range, batch after batch, which is the only way you can supply a restaurant. The restaurant account led to a second one, a taqueria chain with 3 locations across the valley, and by the second year, Yolanda was buying second-hand food-grade barrels by the dozen and had hired her cousin Rosalba part-time to help with the twice-daily stirring and bottling. She still picked up peel from Rio Fresco herself, 3 mornings a week, driving her truck around to the loading dock where a hauler used to come for what was now, essentially, her raw material. Efrain had stopped charging the hauling company for that portion of the waste stream entirely, since Yolanda took enough of it that the cannery's disposal costs had measurably dropped. He told her once, half joking, that she'd done more for his monthly waste budget than any efficiency consultant the company had ever paid for. The last big stretch of growth came through a distributor, a small regional company out of Weslaco that supplied specialty and Mexican grocery stores across 4 counties. They'd heard about her through the restaurant chef and approached her about bottling Tepache for retail shelves rather than just serving it fresh. That meant a different production challenge entirely. Shelf-stable retail product needs its carbonation and fermentation controlled tightly enough that a bottle sitting on a store shelf for a week or two won't build dangerous pressure or keep souring past the point anyone would want to drink it. She worked with a co-packer, a facility that bottles beverages under contract for smaller producers who don't have their own bottling line, to pasteurize the Tepache lightly after fermentation stopped at the right point, halting the yeast activity so the flavor stayed fixed instead of continuing to change in the bottle. It cost her more per unit than bottling it herself, but it let her sell into refrigerated cases at 11 grocery stores by the end of that second year, under a small label she called Peña Dulce, a nod to her grandmother's maiden name. Her mother, who had been quietly skeptical the whole first year, watching her daughter haul garbage bags of pineapple skin through the kitchen, started telling people at the cannery that her daughter ran a beverage company. Efrain Solis put a handwritten sign by the loading dock reserving certain bins for her pickup, and when a second person tried to ask the plant for peel that following year, hoping to copy what Yolanda was doing, he told them it was already spoken for. Doña Refugio, who had never asked for anything and never taken a cent, got a case of bottled Tepache delivered to her porch every month for as long as Yolanda's business ran, and when people in La Jolla asked the old woman if she'd known the girl would make something of all that garbage, she'd just shrug and say she'd only told her to watch the bubbles, and the rest the girl had done on her own. 4 years after that first bucket in the garage, Rio Fresco Cannery was still throwing pineapple crowns and cores in the trash, but the skins, nearly all of them most days, went into the back of a refrigerated van that picked up 3 mornings a week and drove them to a kitchen in Mission, where they fermented for somewhere between 18 and 40 hours depending on the season, got bottled, and ended up cold and fizzy in grocery cases across 4 South Texas counties, selling out most days before the delivery truck had even finished its route. People sometimes ask Yolanda, at the market table or through the grocery store glass as she restocked cases, whether she'd ever gotten tired of the smell. That thick, sweetish rot smell that used to hang around the cannery dumpster and that still, in low concentrations, hung around her kitchen on a fermenting day. She always said no, not anymore, because she'd stopped smelling rot in it years back. What she smelled now was the beginning of a batch, and her nose had learned to sort out the good sour from the bad, the way Doña Refugio's had. She kept the notebook going the whole time, 1 page per batch, temperature readings in the morning and evening, Brix readings from the refractometer, start time, bottling time, and a short note on taste. By the 4th year, the notebook filled 3 volumes, and she could flip back to a July page from 2 summers before and know almost exactly what a barrel started that same week would do, because Valley summers repeat themselves closely enough to be useful even if they never repeat exactly. That was the last thing she understood about the trade, later than she understood almost everything else. That the numbers didn't replace her senses, they just gave her senses something to check themselves against, which is a different thing than most people assume when they hear the word data. Rosalba eventually took over most of the stirring and logging, and Yolanda spent more of her week driving the valley, to the co-packer in Weslaco, to Rio Verde in McAllen, to the grocery accounts, and always, 3 mornings a week no matter what else was on the calendar, to the loading dock at Rio Fresco, where Efrain had a bin already set aside and ready, the peel still warm from that morning's line. He'd wave from the dock, she'd load the barrels into the van herself, and neither of them ever called it anything more than what it was. Her picking up his garbage, and him being glad somebody finally wanted it.